So today we're going to be looking at the spinal cord and spinal nerves. And so if you look at this picture, you can see what that kind of looks like. And remember, we went through this whole thing where we talked about how you can categorize these nerves, and we came up with somatic afferent, somatic efferent, visceral afferent, and visceral efferent, which is also called the autonomic. And then we can split the autonomic into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So those nerves that you see are part of all that. And then you can also see the brain and the spinal cord, which is the central nervous system. So if you remember the central nervous system, when you look at it, we have both gray matter and white matter. So gray matter, remember, is only gray in the cadaver. It's sort of beige looking in a living person. But what it is, remember, are the cell bodies and the synapses and the dendrites. That's the part that's gray matter. So what these cell bodies are, they're arranged in these sort of groups. And a group of cell bodies that are working together is called a nucleus or a center. And so what we're going to see are these all throughout the brain and the spinal cord, these centers where they're performing a common function. And then white matter, remember, is the myelinated part of the neuron. And so white matter is just a bunch of axons. And so remember, axons are like wires, sort of. They're just communication. And so they're also bundled together. And when they're bundled together in the central nervous system, those are called tracts. Well, we have sort of the exact same thing in the peripheral nervous system. We have a bunch of cell bodies. So the cell bodies are grouped together, just like they are in the central nervous system, but they're called a different name. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called ganglia. And so we're going to see ganglia. Same thing's true for axons. So axons in the peripheral nervous system, they're just like the ones in the central nervous system. They're bundled together, but what we call that in the peripheral nervous system is a nerve. And so these two words or two different things sort of are the same. So if you're talking about the central nervous system, we have nuclei or centers, and we have tracts. We have the exact same thing in the peripheral nervous system, except what they're called are ganglia and nerves. So a tract and a nerve are similar, a nucleus and a ganglia are similar. Does that make sense? We also already talked about these nerves. And so remember, we divided them up into somatic and visceral and so on. And I mentioned that a few minutes ago. And so if we look at the flow chart, this is the same flow chart we saw when we started talking about it. We can divide the whole nervous system up into the central nervous system and the peripheral. And if we look at the central nervous system, it's only two parts. It's the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral, remember, we can divide it up into the parts that are going to and parts that are going from the central nervous system, and we can also divide it up into where it's going. So it could be going to the body walls, that would make it somatic. It could be going to internal organs, that would make it visceral or autonomic. And then it could be carrying information to the central nervous system. Remember, that word is afferent. Or it could be carrying information away from the central nervous system. Remember, that word is efferent. And then this system right here, the visceral efferent or the autonomic efferent, has something that no other system has. It's divided up into two separate divisions. One is called sympathetic and one's called parasympathetic. So that's just kind of a review of the things that we've already talked about. And we looked at this before. And so when you look at this, remember, you can tell by the arrow, is it afferent or efferent? So that one's afferent, it's going toward. That one is an efferent because it's going away. Afferent, efferent. And then you can tell by where it goes, what is it, visceral or is it somatic? If it's skin or skeletal muscle, then it's somatic. But if it's any kind of internal organ, like the heart, the lungs, anything like that, it's going to be visceral. Okay, so that's kind of a review of where we were. So let's go ahead and start talking about the central nervous system. So we're going to use the spinal cord first because the spinal cord is simpler than the brain. And so if we look at the spinal cord runs down through the vertebrae. It's in the vertebral canal. And if you look at it, it looks like this. But the spinal cord starts right here. You might think that it ends here, but it doesn't. It ends right here. That's the end of the spinal cord. And that end of the spinal cord happens right around L1 or L2 in the adult. Now, in an infant or a young child, it's L3 or L4 because their spinal cord is longer, but their vertebrae are not. So it ends right around L1 or L2. That makes it about 16 inches long in the average person. And what it is sort of a two-way highway. It's two-way communication from the brain. And so some information is going up to the brain. That's sensory information. And some information is coming down from the brain, and that's motor information. So it's a little bit like a two-way highway. And that's exactly what it is just this communication system. Now there's also some processing that happens in the spinal cord, and we'll talk about that later on. But this is what it kind of looks like. If you do a cross section of the spinal cord, it looks like this. And if you look at it, you can see that it's hollow in the middle. There's a hollow space right there, and it runs up and down the entire spinal cord. That is called the central canal. So the central canal is this hollow space. It's not empty. It has cerebrospinal fluid in it. And that cerebrospinal fluid helps to nourish these tissues, lubricate the tissues, and so on. And then if you look inside the spinal cord, around that central canal, sort of with this butterfly shape, this shape right here, this is gray matter. So all of this is gray matter. And remember, gray matter is going to be cell bodies. It's going to be dendrites. It's going to be synapses. But there are no axons in here. No axons. So what we have in here mostly are small neurons that are connecting sensory neurons over here to motor neurons over here. Remember, those are called interneurons or association neurons. And so that's what we're going to have in here. And here's where processing is going to happen. It happens in the gray matter. And then if you look at it, around the gray matter, we have white matter. So all of this out here, that's white matter. And over here, this is white matter. And white matter, again, is going to be these tracts. It's going to be bundles of axons. And so these axons, most of them anyway, are going to have myelin on them, and that's what makes it white. So hollow in the middle, gray matter around that, and white matter around the outside. Here's a real spinal cord, and hopefully you can pick out those things. So there's the central canal right in the very center, right there. And here's the gray matter right here, and out here is the white matter. You can also see a nerve out here and a nerve over here. And that nerve is bringing information into the spinal cord and carrying information out of the spinal cord. Same thing over here, into the spinal cord and out of the spinal cord. So again, it looks something like this. Another thing you'll notice if you look at this, when you look at the cross section, remember here's what a cross section looks like. It's not the same diameter all the way up and down. It depends on where you make the incision, where you make the cut. Because when you look at it, you can actually see that there are two places, right here and right here, where it got thicker. And so look, it's thicker and then thin again, and then thicker and then thin again. So here it's thin, but here it's thick. And then it gets thin. And here again it gets thick. Well, these thick areas are called enlargements. And there's a cervical enlargement and a lumbar enlargement. And what happens in these enlargements is that the nerves from the upper appendage attach here, and the nerves from the lower appendage attach here. And so when you add more nerves, you're adding more to the spinal cord, then it gets bigger. So we have these enlargements. You can divide the spinal cord up into regions, and there are 5 of these regions. And if you notice, these regions are exactly the same as we saw with the vertebrae. So remember the vertebrae, it looks something like this. It's curved from the side, and we had 7 cervical vertebrae and 12 thoracic vertebrae and 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and then 4 coccygeal. And those regions on the vertebrae are exactly the same in the spinal cord. And so we have cervical, we have thoracic, we have lumbar, we have sacral, and we have coccygeal. So 5 regions, and you can see those 5 regions right here. Well, there are nerves which attach to the spinal cord. They're called spinal nerves. And the nerves, if you notice, they pass between the vertebrae. Remember when you stack up vertebrae, there's this intervertebral foramen between them. And a pair of nerves comes out, one on each side. Well, if we count how many nerves there are that come out in each section, that gives us a segment. And so there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And so there are 31 segments of the spinal cord. And if we look at them, you can see them here. Well, except for in one place, it's exactly the same as the vertebrae. Remember the vertebrae, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae. There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves. Remember 5 lumbar vertebrae. There are 5 pairs of lumbar nerves. 5 in the sacrum. Remember, it fused into a single bone, but we could still see where the 5 were. There are 5 sacral nerve pairs. And then there's a single coccygeal nerve pair. The only place where it's different is here. And the reason it's different here is because the very first nerve comes off before the first vertebra. So it comes off above the atlas. And so if you look at it, the skull would be right here. And then the first vertebra would be right there. Well, this nerve comes off before that. It comes off between the skull and the atlas. And so instead of having 7 pairs, we're going to have this extra nerve. There's the extra one. And so instead of having 7, we're going to have 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. So when you look at it, here they are. And they're named just like we named them before, from top to bottom. So pairs of cervical nerves, there's C1 to C8. 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, they're T1 to T12. Lumbar, L1 to L5. Sacral, S1 to S5. And coccygeal, CO1. And the reason it's CO is because we already used C up here, and it would be confusing if we didn't add some sort of modifier. So here are those nerves. Any questions about the nerves? Again, we already talked about where the nerves from the upper appendage attaches. We're going to get the cervical enlargement. The nerves where the lower appendage attach, we're going to get the lumbar enlargement. And so if we were to do cross sections through here, it's easy to see that. So look how much thicker and wider that is than that. So this is the cervical enlargement. And then it gets sort of skinny right here. And then it gets bigger again right here. And this is the lumbar enlargement. And then there it is, it gets sort of skinny again. And so we can see that. So cervical enlargement and lumbar enlargement. We also already said that it's hollow in the middle and there's cerebrospinal fluid in it, and that is called the central canal. And so here we can see that central canal right here. We also talked about white matter and gray matter. Remember, the spinal cord ends right around L1 or L2. So that means if you follow the spinal cord down, it ends. Another thing is the very ending of it is sort of cone-shaped. So this end, this cone-shaped end right here, has a name. It's called the conus medullaris. And then remember, there are nerves which come off between each two vertebrae. So here's a pair of nerves and here's a pair of nerves. Remember, there are 31 of these pairs of nerves. But look, when I get here, the spinal cord ends, but the nerves don't end. So the nerves now have to do this. They have to hang down and come out. Hang down and come out like this. And what you see, when you see that, it begins to look a lot like a horse's tail. And so that's what it's called. It's called the cauda, which means tail, equina, which means horse. And so we can see that right here. There is this conus medullaris, and there is the cauda equina. If we blow that up and look at it a little bit, you can see it even better. There's our conus medullaris, and there's the cauda equina. And look how much like a horse's tail it looks. And for real, it looks even more like a horse's tail. So here are those nerves. These are actual nerves. So there's the cauda equina right here. And then here is our conus medullaris right here. This is a pretty delicate structure, and so we want to be able to protect it pretty well, because if you damage it, you lose function of other organs. And so the spinal cord is pretty well protected. First we have skin, and then we have things like fat and connective tissue, and then we have muscle, and then we have bone. But then inside the bone there are membranes. And the membranes surround the spinal cord. They also keep it from moving around. They provide physical stability so that it doesn't flop one way or the other or go up or down. It also provides shock absorption. Well, there are 3 of these membranes, 3 layers. Their names are in Italian. And look what their names mean. It means tough mother, spiderweb-like, and gentle mother. So Italian for tough mother is Dura mater. Mater means mother, and Dura, like durable, is tough. And then arachnoid or arachnids are spiders, and so this is spiderweb-like. And then pia mater, mater means mother, pia means soft or gentle. And so we can see these 3 right here. So here's our dura, here's our arachnoid, and here's our pia mater right here. Dura, arachnoid, pia. And if you look at the cross section of the spinal cord, you can see it. It goes all the way around. All of these go all the way around. So let's look at them. Let's look at the dura mater first. So here's the dura mater right here. And the best way to think about this is almost think of it like leather. It is leathery. That means it's tough, it's thick, it's very strong. It's made out of dense, irregular connective tissue, just like leather is. You can see blood vessels in here and so on, but it's thick, it's tough. If you follow it all the way to the bottom, here's our spinal cord right here, and here's the dura mater right here. If you follow it all the way to the bottom, what it does when it gets to the bottom is it keeps going. The two sides are all fused together and it forms a ligament. And the ligament comes down and attaches to the tailbone. It attaches to the coccyx. And what it does is it keeps the spinal cord from moving up and down. In other words, it anchors it so that it can't move up and down. On top of the dura, out here between the dura and the bone, is a layer of fat. And because it's on top of the dura, remember the prefix for on top of is epi. This is called the epidural space. And the epidural space is filled with this fat. And so if we look at it in cross section, the epidural space would be up here. And remember, fat is very shock absorbing. It also helps to spread out any kind of impact and absorb that shock. So it helps protect the spinal cord. So that's the dura mater. Let's look at and here you can see the dura mater in a dissection. So here's the dura mater over here. It's been cut open and folded back. Let's look at the arachnoid. So the arachnoid, remember this word means spider or spider web-like. Well, when you look at it, a spider web has a lot of fibers like this. And of course they're in a pattern, and I'm not drawing a pattern very well, but they're fibers with lots of spaces in between. And that's exactly the way this is. These fibers create a space, and the space is called the subarachnoid space. And there's also cerebrospinal fluid here. So if you look at it, it's this blue one here. So here are the fibers that look like a little spider web sort of, and then here's those spaces that are created, and inside those spaces are where we're going to find cerebrospinal fluid. So there's cerebrospinal fluid in the middle of the spinal cord, and there's cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the spinal cord. Remember, cerebrospinal fluid is nourishing. It also absorbs shock and helps protect the tissues beneath it. Another thing about the arachnoid is it does not have any blood vessels. It's avascular. So when we look in here, you don't see any blood vessels. Now there are blood vessels here, but they're part of the layer beneath, not this layer here. So that's the arachnoid. And again, you can see blood vessels, but remember they're not part of this layer, they're part of this layer, which we're going to look at next. So here's the arachnoid. And if you look at it, it looks sort of like milky here or filmy. And again, that's because it's got these fibers, and you can kind of see the fibers in here, not very well, but you can see them a little bit. And again, there's fluid beneath this layer. Okay, let's look at the pia mater. So remember, pia means gentle. Well, the reason it's called that is because it's very delicate. This is a very thin membrane. It's very delicate. It's got tons of blood vessels in it, so it's very, very vascular. This is so tightly adhered to the spinal cord that you really cannot get it off. And so when you look at it, here's the spinal cord right here, and there's the layer right there, this red layer. And it's so tightly adhered, you cannot separate it without ripping up the spinal cord. And look, it folds in everywhere this folds in. And then there are lots of blood vessels in it, lots of them. And so those blood vessels are going to provide oxygen and nutrition to the tissues of the spinal cord. And then if you look at the spinal cord, it looks sort of like this in cross section. And here's this pia mater right here, very, very tightly adhered to it. You cannot get it off. Looks like that, sort of. But at the sides, in fact, it's on 3 sides, what this does is it sticks out like this and sticks out like this. It also happens over here like this. And what it does is it provides these little tiny thin ligaments. And they look a little bit like the teeth on a comb when you look at them up and down. And so the word for teeth is dent. And so these are called denticulate ligaments. And what they do is they anchor the pia mater to the dura mater. So here's the dura mater out here. And so it anchors it to the dura mater. And what this does is it prevents the spinal cord from moving side to side. So again, it's going to stabilize the spinal cord so that there's no side to side movements. Well, you can see this also. And so when we look at it here, we can actually see these little teeth-like things. And there's a better picture here. You can see them right here, these little teeth-like things, denticulate ligaments. And then another thing, when we look at the pia mater, not only does it extend out side to side, but if you look at the drawing of the spinal cord in long, like this, so it's going to stick out here side to side. Let's use a different color. Like little teeth going all the way up and down on each side. It's actually 3 sides. But it also, when it gets to the bottom, what it's going to do is it's going to fuse together and form another tiny little ligament. So this tiny little ligament is inside the middle part of that bigger ligament. That one was the coccygeal ligament. But in the center of it is what's called the filum terminale. So the filum terminale is an extension of the pia mater that attaches to this coccyx. And so again, that's going to help prevent up and down movements. So in other words, the spinal cord can't move up and down. Can't do that. And it can't move side to side. It can't do that. And so that's all been prevented. And so it's sort of locked in place so that it doesn't bounce around inside the vertebral canal. So here's a different drawing. And look, you can see a couple of different things here that you could on the others. Here are the denticulate ligaments right here. There's our epidural space right there. And remember, this is fat. This is adipose tissue. We can also see the 3 layers here. So here is the dura mater right here. That's the dura mater. And the arachnoid, you can't see it very well, but it's in there. And then here is the pia mater right here. And we can see this subarachnoid space right here. And again, there's cerebrospinal fluid in it. So the cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the spinal cord completely. It's inside right here and surrounds it completely. We look here, remember we already talked about the enlargement, so we can see the lumbar enlargement right there. We talked about the conus medullaris, which is right there. There's that filum terminale that we were just talking about. And remember, it's going to go all the way down to the tailbone. And it's going to anchor to the tailbone. Remember, this is pia mater. So it's not very thick. And remember, it's inside the coccygeal ligament, which is this out here, and is much thicker. So we have these stabilizers. And remember, the whole point of these stabilizers is to prevent movement. We don't want it moving up and down. We don't want it moving side to side. We don't want it flopping around in there because remember, it's delicate and bone is hard. So if it were to hit the bone, it would bruise the spinal cord. So remember, we have the coccygeal ligament. That's part of the dura mater. And then we have the denticulate ligaments. That's the side-to-side extensions of the pia mater. And then we have the filum terminale, and that's the extension of the pia mater that goes down to the coccyx. So we don't have up and down movement, and we don't have side-to-side movement. Any questions? Okay, well, those are the membranes. Let's look at the spinal cord itself. Remember, we already talked about gray matter and we talked about white matter. Gray matter, remember, is the cell bodies, the dendrites. It's also got a lot of neuroglia in it, and gray matter is where we're going to get interpretation and integration, processing. This is where this is going to happen. And then we have white matter. And remember, white matter is myelinated and some unmyelinated axons. But axons don't process information. All they do is send and receive action potentials. So axons are just areas of communication. They're like wires that connect things together so that one place can talk to another place. They're like wires. So if we look in here, we can see the gray matter and we can see the white matter. Here's a blow up of that. Here's the gray matter right here. And look, you can see some neurons in here. There's also a ton of neuroglia in here. And then out here is the white matter. And what you see, it looks like a bunch of eyeballs. Well, when you look at it, this is in cross section. So what we're seeing, if we blow it up in the center, which looks like the pupil of the eyeball, that is an axon. And what the white part around the outside is the oligodendrocytes. Remember, oligodendrocytes are what make myelin inside the central nervous system. So that's an oligodendrocyte. So when you look at it, you can see thousands and thousands and thousands of these. Now, because this is in cross section, these are running up and down the spinal cord. So they're carrying information to the brain, or they're carrying information from the brain. It's not as obvious, but there are also some that are going sideways. You can see them here. And so those are carrying information from one part of the spinal cord to another part of the spinal cord. Well, let's look at this gray matter first. So remember gray matter, cell bodies, dendrites, synapses. Well, when you look at it, it looks a lot like a butterfly. And so butterflies have wings. We don't call them wings here. They're called horns. Well, the horns and everything is named for a direction. So the first thing we have to be able to do is tell anterior from posterior. And there's several ways to do it. One way to do it is to look at the gray matter. When you look at it, here's a horn right here. Here's another horn, and here's another one. Well, if you look at it, the horns don't look exactly alike. These horns go all the way to the surface and they're pointy. They go all the way to the surface and they're pointy. Those are the posterior horns. So that means this side over here is posterior. And if this side is posterior, that means this one is anterior. And this one over here is going to be lateral. And this one over here is going to be lateral. And so that's how we're going to name these horns. So when you look at them, look, we have posterior, which can also be called dorsal, horns. We have anterior, which can also be called ventral, horns. And then we have lateral horns. There's also a bridge. And the word for bridge is commissure. Commissure means something that goes from one side to the other. Well, you can see it, and what this commissure looks like is the body of the butterfly. It's gray, so it's called the gray commissure. So when we look at this, that's the first thing we can see. Here is the gray commissure. And right in the center of the gray commissure is going to be the central canal. And then we have horns. So remember, pointy and go all the way to the surface. Pointy and go all the way to the surface. Those are the dorsal horns. Well, if those are the dorsal horns, that makes these the lateral horns, and it makes these the ventral horns. Now remember, you can also call dorsal posterior, and you can also call ventral anterior. But not that many people do. So look, even on this one, and if you erase all the words, I can see that these are pointy and they go all the way to the surface. They're pointy and they go all the way to the surface. These don't do that. Look, they're like rounded at the bottom and they don't make it to the surface, which means that this is our dorsal or posterior horn. There's our lateral, and here's our ventral or anterior horn. Can everybody see how to do that? You can also see the central canal here, and you can see the gray commissure right there. If you look here, you can see it again, pointy and go all the way to the surface. So those are dorsal. These are ventral, and these are lateral. Well, remember this butterfly, it's gray matter. And gray matter is where we have dendrites, and we have cell bodies, and we have synapses. And so gray matter is all about processing information. It's about integration and interpretation. It's processing information. And so if you look here, what we're going to see are there 4 zones, and different information is processed in each zone. And the easiest way to learn this is just to learn it in order. And so if we look at it, we're going to start over here at the dorsal horn right there. That's the dorsal. Pointy goes all the way to the surface. And then the first zone is somatic sensory. The second zone is visceral sensory. And then we're going to have motors. And it starts with visceral motor and somatic motor. So look at this. If I were to draw a line right through the center right here, this side of the spinal cord, the dorsal side, is sensory. And if I drew that line and looked at it, the ventral side is motor. But again, the easiest way to remember this is just to learn it in order. Somatic sensory, visceral sensory. That's on the dorsal side. And then visceral motor, somatic motor, and that's on the ventral side. So what do these words mean? Somatic sensory. Well, remember, somatic means body wall, skin and muscle. And sensory refers to information that's being picked up to take to the brain. And so somatic sensory is carrying information to the brain. It's coming from your skin and your skeletal muscles. And so it could be things like touch and temperature or pressure, or it could be like pain or something like that. But it's sensory information from the skin and from the skeletal muscles. And so if we look at this, there are neurons coming in and they're going to terminate right here from the skin, from the skeletal muscle. Sensory, and it's somatic. And then if we look at the second one, it's visceral sensory. So visceral sensory, again, visceral means we're carrying information up to the brain or the spinal cord to be processed. It's coming from internal organs. So these are things like the heart, the lungs, the intestines, the GI tract of all the different parts, the bladder, the rectum, all of that stuff. Those are sensory. And so the sensory information is going to come in from there, and it's going to wind up right here. So we're coming in, and it's going to terminate here. Could be from the heart. And then we're going to have visceral motor. So this part right here is going to make decisions. And it's going to tell internal organs what they're supposed to do. So this part is going to say, speed up the heart rate, slow down the heart rate, increase the contractions in the stomach, decrease the contractions in the stomach. All of that. Empty the bladder, empty the rectum. And so there are neurons that are going to start here. And those neurons are going to go out to internal organs, out to the heart. So it's motor information. And then we have somatic motor. And somatic motor, what that means is motor to skeletal muscles. In other words, when we want to move our leg or our arm or anything below the neck, suck in your stomach, anything like that, there's going to be a neuron that's going to start here, and it's going to go out to that skeletal muscle and tell that skeletal muscle to contract. So that's what these different areas are doing. So again, if we draw this line right through the middle, again, this whole side is sensory. And this whole side is motor. Now, they don't draw it over here, but you have the exact same regions over here as well. And you're going to have neurons going out this way or coming in this way. So here's another picture blown up. And again, these are the order. We're going to start on the dorsal side, somatic sensory, visceral sensory, visceral motor, somatic motor. Can everybody do that? And then here, this picture shows you the neurons. So look, this neuron right here, I could ask you, where is this neuron going or coming from? Well, look, it's going to this area right here, which is somatic sensory. That's where it ended up. So it's coming from the skin or the skeletal muscles. And when it comes from the skin, it's going to go in and it's going to carry that information. I could ask you the same thing about this neuron. Where's that one neuron going to or coming from? Well, look, it's going to here, which is visceral sensory. So it's sensory from, say, the heart or the lungs or whatever. It's carrying information in here to be processed. Same thing with these others. So if you look at this one, that's somatic motor. That's going to skeletal muscle to tell it to contract. And if you look at this one, that's visceral motor. That's going to the internal organs, to the heart to tell it to beat faster or beat slower or so on. Any questions? Well, when we get into the spinal cord, remember we're going to have white matter. And white matter, remember, is myelinated and also some unmyelinated axons. And we saw this when we looked at white matter. Remember, we saw all those things that look like eyeballs, and the pupil of the eyeball was an axon, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these things. Well, some axons are carrying information up to the brain. And you can kind of think of it like an elevator. If you go to some place and there's an elevator and you push the button, well, if you get in the elevator and the elevator goes up, we say you are ascending. And so these are ascending tracts. The information is going up. But you could also get in the elevator and go down, and we would say that you're descending. So that information is carrying the information down, away from the brain. And then sometimes these axons go this way or this way. So like you could walk down the hallway to another elevator. And so if you want to walk over here, before you can go up or down, you have to walk this way. You have to walk across. And that's called transverse. So 3 different types of axons, and they're categorized based on which way the information is going. It's either going up to the brain, down from the brain, or across within the spinal cord. Well, these tracts are divided up into bundles. And these bundles are large, large bundles of axons. They're called columns. So think about a column. A column runs up and down like this. And you can have one column next to another column, next to another column. And columns are big bundles of things. They're strong, they're big. So if we look in here, there are tons of axons in here. And those axons are in these bundles. Well, the word for column is funiculus. And so that's what they're called, funiculi. And so there are 3 columns on each side. And again, we're going to use the same way we did before to name them. We're going to use those directions. And so we're going to have posterior, we're going to have anterior, and we're going to have lateral. So if we look at our spinal cord, the way we know to do posterior is we look here at the gray matter. It's pointy and goes all the way to the surface. So if this is posterior, this is dorsal, then this right here is a dorsal column or a posterior column. So here's a column right here. And here's a column right here. And then there's a column on each side. So we have a dorsal or posterior column or funiculus. We have a ventral or anterior column or funiculus. And then there are two lateral columns or funiculi. So if we blow that up, here's the dorsal right here, one on each side. And here's the ventral right here, one on each side. And then here's the lateral right here, one on each side. So we have a posterior funiculus on each side, a lateral funiculus on each side, and a ventral funiculus on each side. So take a pause when you get here and try to answer all these questions and figure out what each of these letters represent. We have not gone over J yet, so you may not be able to do J. Okay, there's another one you can practice on as well. Okay, well, remember we had three columns. And remember, columns are big things that are going up and down. Well, you can have inside those big things smaller things. So look, I could have inside this column, I could have this smaller up and down thing and this smaller up and down thing. It's going to stay in the column, but they're smaller. Same thing over here. Same thing over here. Well, these smaller things that are going up and down are called tracts. So remember, a tract is similar to a nerve. It's a bunch of axons, similar to a nerve. But it's inside the central nervous system. It's not outside like nerves are. Well, when you look at it, each funiculus is divided up into these tracts. And tracts are just named for the direction the information is going. Again, it's like an elevator. You get in the elevator and you go up, that's ascending. So we have ascending tracts. So that information is going to the brain. It's going up the spinal cord to the brain. But we also have descending tracts. So that information is going down. It's going from the brain. And so that information is going this way. And just like in a road or a highway or something, you can have one tract right next to another tract. That one's going this way, and this one's going this way. Now, tracts don't intermix, though, because they're surrounded with connective tissue. And the connective tissue keeps the information from bleeding over to another tract. But here's what those tracts look like. So remember, we had three columns. Here was our dorsal column right here, or dorsal funiculus. Here was our ventral funiculus, one on each side, right here and right here. And then here was our lateral funiculus right here on each side and right here. And then if you look inside here, what you're going to see are tracts. And again, some tracts are descending, some tracts are ascending. Well, in this picture, the blue ones are ascending tracts. So everywhere it's blue, it's going up. The information is headed up to the brain. And the red ones are descending tracts. Let me pick a different color. They're descending tracts. So the information is coming down from the brain. Well, in lab, we're going to spend more time learning the names of these tracts, but we are going to go over them here, and so you can go ahead and learn them here as well. And so when you look at these tracts, this is one tract here, and this is a tract here. This is a tract, and this is a tract. And then you can see these others because they're different colors and they're easy. But look, this is descending, it's blue. I'm sorry, ascending is blue. Ascending, ascending, ascending. Red is descending. So if we look at these tracts, this is the first one we're going to look at. So this is the tract right here. And it's called the fasciculus gracilis. Fasciculus means cord. And gracilis means delicate or graceful, delicate cord. And there's one on each side, so there's another one right there. So these are ascending tracts. And then, if we add another one, that's this one right here. There's another one over here. And these are called fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus means cord, and cuneatus means wedge-shaped. And look at it, they are wedge-shaped. They're narrow in the inside and wide out here. They're wedge-shaped. Together, those are called the dorsal columns. We'll come back to them in a little bit. We also, though, have these two, and these are the spinocerebellars. Remember, we can tell the difference between anterior and posterior. There's pointy right here. Pointy is posterior. So if we were to draw a line like that, this side is posterior or dorsal. So this is the posterior spinocerebellar. It's called posterior because it's on the posterior side. It's called spinocerebellar because it goes from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. We also have an anterior spinocerebellar. And then these are called spinothalamics. And there's a lateral spinothalamic and an anterior spinothalamic. Lateral because it's on the side, spinothalamic because it goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus, which is a different part of the brain. So those are the ascending tracts. Any questions about them? We also have descending tracts. The descending tracts are those red ones. But let's go ahead and talk about these ascending tracts a little bit before we start. So remember, ascending means the information is going up. So the information is going up to the brain. All of these up to the brain. up to the brain. And where they're coming from are different parts of the body. So they're coming in like this, and then they're going up to the brain. They're coming in like this, and they're going up to the brain, like this, up to the brain. Well, that means they're coming from somewhere. It could be skin, it could be muscle, it could be whatever. But that information is going up to the brain. And so if we look at it, in general, it takes more than one neuron to get to the brain. So look, we could start with the hand. So if we started with the hand, let's say we start with your thumb, and I want to get over here to the brain to tell you that you've been slammed your finger in a door of a car or something. Well, look, the information has got to go this way and then all the way up, and it's got to go to part of the brain for you to recognize it. Well, it takes more than one neuron to get there. So we're going to have one neuron that goes part of the way, and then another neuron is going to pick up and go part of the way, and another neuron is going to pick up and go the rest of the way. In general, it takes 2 or 3 neurons to get to where you're going. And then they don't just go to random places. If you're talking about the thumb, there's a specific place on your brain for thumb, a specific place that you got to get to for the thumb, one on each side. So I've got to get there. Remember, it's going to take 2 or 3 neurons to get there, but I'm not going to go somewhere random. I'm only going to go to this place. That place means thumb. It's almost like there's a map on the brain of your whole body. And so the brain has this very precise spatial relationship with all the different parts of the brain, of the body. There's a word for that, and the word is somatotopy. Soma means body, and topy means map. So it's a body map on the brain. Another characteristic is that the pathways are paired. There's one on each side. We already saw one on each side for funiculus, one on each side for tracts. It's always one on each side. And then something kind of weird happens. And what happens is the fibers from this side go over here. And the fibers from this side go over here. In other words, they cross over right here. They cross over. They go to the other side. And the word for that is decusate. So these are 2 words that you need to learn and be able to use. Somatotopy and decusate. You'll see these over and over again. Again, we have these ascending tracts. We learned these. Remember, we had fasciculus gracilis, we had fasciculus cuneatus, anterior spinothalamic, lateral spinothalamic, 2 spinocerebellars. So let's look at the characteristics of each one of these. So, the first ones we're going to look at are these. The fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Together they're called the dorsal columns. And the reason they call that is because that's where they are. They're right here. This is where they are. So there's our gracilis, and there's our cuneatus on this side, and there's our gracilis, and there's our cuneatus on this side. And if you look at this posterior column has nothing but ascending tracts. That's it. There's no descending. And so this whole area is nothing but sensory. And it's going to be sensory from all our different body parts. So it's going to be from your fingers and your toes and your arms and your legs and your front and your back and so on. All different body parts. And if you remember the skin of your different body parts, we talked about it, they have all these little receptors in here. We have these Meissner's corpuscles, and we have these Pacinian corpuscles, and there's also heat receptors and all sorts of things in the skin. In the joints, there are joint receptors to tell you if your joints are bent, or straight, and so on. All that information is going to go up the spinal cord, up to the brain, up to the spinal cord, up to the brain. Again, remember, it's going to take more than one neuron to get there, either 2 or 3. The fibers are going to cross over. Remember, that's called decussation. And they're going to go to a very, very specific part of the brain for each individual body part. And remember, that's called somatotopy. So let's look at these dorsal columns. So we have the fasciculus gracilis, which comes from the lower appendages. It comes from your feet and your legs. Mostly from the skin, but also from the muscles and the joints. And then we have the fasciculus cuneatus, which comes from the arms and the hands. Again, mostly from the skin, but also the joints and the muscles. And it's going to go to the brain. It's going to tell you, are you being touched? Is there pressure being applied? Is something hot, cold? Does something hurt? All of that information is going to be carried up to the brain. Well, some information is carried on some tracts and some are carried on other tracts. The information that's carried on the dorsal columns is this. It's fine touch. Fine touch. That means running your fingers across something and feeling tiny little bumps. You've ever gotten, I don't know, a sticker in your skin. You can run your fingers along it. Even if you can't see that sticker, you can find it. You can feel it. You can read Braille with your fingers. People do that. It's how the blind people read. That's because there are these little tiny bumps. You can feel all sorts of imperfections. It's fine touch. You can feel a thread. You can feel a single hair. It's fine touch. Another thing this carries is what's called two-point discrimination. What that means is you can tell whether you're being touched by one thing or two things. So if you look at the skin of the fingertip versus the skin of, say, your elbow, if you look at the skin of your fingertip, it's got a lot of neurons in it. So here's the neuron right here. So there's one neuron, and there's another neuron, and there's another one. There's a lot of neurons. So if we were to label all these neurons, we'll call this one A, B, C, D, and E. It would look like that. But if you look at your elbow, it looks like this. Here's a neuron. And here's a neuron in the same amount of skin. There's only neuron A and B. So look, if I took a pen and I touched you on your fingertip right there, that information would only go in on A. It wouldn't go in on B or any of those others. If I took a pen and touched you right there, it would only go in on B. And so look, these are two different neurons, which means I can detect two different pins touching me. But if I took the exact same two pins and moved them over here, there's one, and the same distance away, there's one. Look, they're both going to go in on this neuron. And your brain is not going to be able to tell the difference if there's just one of these pins or two of these pins touching you, because it's on a single neuron. So this would be fine touch over here. It would be two-point discrimination with a high degree, whereas this would be gross touch over here, big touch. And you would have a low degree of two-point discrimination. And then finally, the last thing that's carried on this is vibration. And then we also said it's going to take 2 or 3 neurons. Well, it takes 3 neurons. And in order to talk about them, we need to name them. Well, they're named extremely easy. They're just first order, second order, and third order neurons. And then don't forget, it's not going to go to a random place. It's going to go to a very specific place in the brain. And again, the word for that is somatotopy. So we have 3 neurons, we have somatotopy, and we have decussation, and the information carried here is fine touch, two-point discrimination, and vibration. So if we look at it, here's where they are right here. And so if we look at it in what the pathway looks like, here they are. The pathway looks like this. So it's going to come in, it's going to go up, and there's where this first one's going to end, right there. And this second one is going to pick up and it's going to end right there. And here comes the third one. And look where this is coming from. It's coming from that part of your body because there's a map up here. And so I know exactly this is coming from your pinky finger. And then we have 3 neurons. So what are we going to call this one? We're going to call it a first order neuron. What are we going to call this? It's a second order neuron. And there's the third order neuron. It takes 3 neurons to get from where we start, which was our pinky, to get to where we're going. 3 neurons. And then look, right there, they're going to cross over. And remember, the word for that is decussation. And then they're going to go to a very, very, very specific spot. And again, the word for that is somatotopy. So here's another picture, and we can follow it all the way. So look, that's the thumb right there, the thumb. And that to me looks like a Pacinian corpuscle. So actually it's not, it's a joint receptor. So when you bend your thumb, to know what position your thumb is in, we're going to send that information up to the brain. Here's our first order. We're going to synapse. There's our second order. We're going to go up here. We're going to synapse. There's our third order neuron. Right here, we're going to cross over. Again, that's decussation. And I don't have it drawn, but there's a map up here. And that part right there for the map is the thumb. Does it make sense? Let's look at another example. So look, here's a touch receptor on the bottom of your foot. So here's our first order neuron. Comes in, goes up. There's our second order neuron. Comes in, goes up. There's our third order neuron. And right there, the map is the bottom of the foot. Right here, it crosses over. Again, that's decussation. The fibers decussate. And right there, remember, that means foot. That's somatotopy, because there's this precise spatial arrangement with the body. So, those are the dorsal columns. Here you can see that decussation happening right here. That's decussation. All right, let's look at the spinothalamics. So these are the spinothalamics right here, and there are two of these. Remember, there's a lateral and an anterior. They also carry information from your skin and your skeletal muscles and your joints. But they carry a different kind of information. They carry information which is gross touch. Gross touch, big touch. Not fine touch, but big touch. They also carry temperature and they carry pain. So if somebody pinches you and it hurts, this information is going to go up the spinothalamic tracts. If somebody burns you with I don't know, anything, if you burn yourself, it's going to go up these spinothalamic tracts. And then if someone bumps into you, that's gross touch. Or if you push your arm against the door frame, that's gross touch. Still going to take 3 neurons to get to where we're going. We're still going to call them first order, second order, third order neurons, just like before. They're still going to decussate. They're going to cross over, and they're going to go to a very specific spot. So we're going to have somatotopy. But that's these here. They may be coming from the exact same parts of the body as here, but they carry different information, and so they're on different tracks. Remember, this is fine touch, it's vibration, it's 2-point discrimination. This is gross touch, it's temperature, it's pain. Again, here's our first order, here's our second order, there's our third order. Again, we're going to be crossing over, that's decussation. And look, it's going to go again to that very specific spot. That's somatotopy. So if we look at it, look, somebody cut their finger. In fact, it looks like they cut their finger off, but there's a razor blade. They cut their finger. That's not fine touch. That's pain. And so it's going to go in on this one. And so here is our first order neuron. And look, there's a synapse right there. It's different from before. Here's the synapse. So first order. Here's the second order right here. And look what happened. It crossed over. We got decussation. So decussation happens right there. And then it's going to go up, and then here is our third order right there. And the third order is going to go to the same spot we saw before, because that meant hand. But the information is coming in on a different tract. And so the brain interprets the information here, but on this tract, as being painful. Or here's another example. Look. Someone lit a match and touched someone on the foot. That's temperature. It could also be pain, depending on how long it's there. But it's going to go in on this track. So there's our first order. There we're going to get decussation right there. here's our second order. It's going to go up, and here's our third order, and it's going to go to that very same specific spot as before, foot. But because it's coming in on a different tract, the brain is going to interpret it as a different sensation. But again, first order, second order, third order, decussation, specific spot. Now, if you noticed, our crossing over happened in a different place on these neurons than it did on those others. The spinothalamics cross over in the spinal cord at the level they enter. Right there is where the crossing over happens. But if we go back and look where crossing over happens here, it doesn't happen until you get up to the base of the brain. It happens here in a part of the brain called the medulla. So that's also something that's different. So if you compare the dorsal column with the spinothalamic, look, here it is. Touch receptors or proprioceptors to tell you your joint's bent or not, muscles are contracted or not. There's our first order. Comes all the way up to the base of the brain. That's where decussation happens. And there's our second order. It goes all the way up to this, which is called the thalamus. And then there's our third order. And then it's going to go to a very, very specific spot. If you look at the spinothalamics, though, comes in, look, it's either pain or temperature, comes in, and crossing over happens immediately. Decussation happens right when you enter the spinal cord. And then we have that was the first order. And then we have the second order. That's where the decussation happens. And then we have the third order. And look, it went to the exact same spot, but because it's on a different tract, we can tell the difference if it's touch or vibration or body position versus is it pain or temperature, because it's on a different tract. Any questions? This is a nice slide showing you the comparison between the two. Okay, we have one more, and these are the spinocerebellar tracts. So they go up the spinal cord, but they're going to go to a different part of the brain. When we look at these parts of the brain here, both of these go to the cerebrum. But the cerebellum is down here almost. It's right here. And so it's going to be a little bit different. For one thing, it doesn't take as many neurons to get there. Instead of taking 3, it only takes 2 neurons. And so we're only going to have a first order and a second order. There's not going to be a third order neuron. And if we look at it, we can see it right here. So it comes from here. There's our first order. And here's our second order. There is no third order because it doesn't have to go as far. It only has to go this far. It doesn't have to go up the rest of the way. Another difference is sometimes the fibers decussate, sometimes they don't. So if we look at this one, look, it's on this side and it's on this side. It did not decussate. There's no decussation here. So that's also very different. And then the third thing that makes them different is the type of information that's carried. The cerebellum, which is where this information is going, is all about muscles. It's all about where muscles are located, their position, are they contracted or relaxed, all that kind of information. And so this is all about muscle position and then anything to do with any kind of coordination of muscles. So when we look at it, look, it starts in a muscle. And there's a receptor in there to tell you, is this muscle contracted or relaxed? There it is right there. Is it contracted or relaxed? What position is this muscle in? And here's our first order neuron. Look, no decussation, did not. And then here's our second order neuron. And then again, it goes to a very specific spot. We still have somatotopy. It's not on the cerebrum, it's on the cerebellum, but it's still a very specific spot for that particular muscle. Let's look at the descending tracts. So the descending tracts, remember, are carrying information from the brain. So the information is coming down. It's some sort of decision that was made. And the decision might have been to contract a muscle or something like that. The decision was made. We're going to tell somebody what to do. And again, it's going to carry on these tracts. Well, if you look at these tracts, there's two which are called corticospinals. Corticospinal. And corticospinal means that it starts in a part of the brain called the cortex. The cortex. Now, we haven't talked about the brain much yet, but the cortex is the part of your brain that's conscious. It's where the part of your brain that tells you what's going on. You're very aware of it. It's where you make conscious decisions. So anything with this word cortico in it is going to come from the cortex. But there are other parts of the brain which are not cortex. And so if it doesn't start with cortico, it's going to come from somewhere else. Look, this one starts with the rubro. That's not cortex. This one starts with reticulo. That's not cortex. This one starts with vestibulo and tecto. None of those are cortex. Only the ones that start with cortico. And cortex, remember, is conscious information. It's conscious decisions. Well, if it's not cortex, it's going to be subconscious or even unconscious decisions. It doesn't mean you don't have control over it. It just means you're not very much aware of what's going on. So when we look at these, here are the descending tracts. So there are two corticos. Now the rubro, there are two reticulos. And then we have the vestibulo and tecto spinals. Well, we can divide these up into two different groups. If it says cortico, it's called pyramidal. They're pyramidal tracts. It does not mean the tract looks like a pyramid. The tract looks just like this. But if you follow these things up to the spine, to the brain, here's what the cell body of those neurons looks like. They're shaped like a pyramid. So they're called pyramidal cells. And so the tract is called a pyramidal tract. So again, if it starts with cortico, it's pyramidal. If it does not start with cortico, and you follow the tract up, the cells are not shaped like that. They're just round like this. They're not pyramidal cells. And so these are not pyramidal tracts. And so the non-pyramidal tracts are anything that does not start with cortico. So rubro, tecto, reticulo, vestibulo, anything that does not start with cortico. So when we look here, there's a corticospinal tract, and there's a corticospinal tract somewhere. Oh, it's only labeled on one side. Sorry, there's the corticospinal tract. I was looking over here. But anyway, it's these two right here, and these two right here. Well, these corticospinal tracts control conscious information. And the information is fast, fine, skilled movements. Fast, fine, skilled movements. And so what is a fast, fine, skilled movement? Well, think about texting, or typing, or playing the piano, or playing, I don't know, any other musical instrument. But anything to do, knitting, anything to do with things like your hands, where it happens fast and the movements are small. They're fine and skilled movements. In other words, it's something you have to practice to get good at. It's not running, it's not jumping, it's not walking, it's nothing like that. It's fast, fine, skilled movements. And most of those skilled movements have to do with your fingers. We also have some skilled movements basically with our feet as well, with our toes and feet, but not as much. So if we go back and look at the relative sizes of these, look how big that is compared to the size of that one. This one is for fingers and hands, and this one is for toes and feet. Well, we have a whole lot more control over our hands and fingers than we do our toes and feet, and that's because there's a whole lot more neurons here. Lots more neurons. And so there's more individual control over those muscles. Well, again, it takes more than one neuron to get to where you're going. It takes two. So if we look at it, remember it's going to start up here in the brain. And then it's going to go down to some muscle, the muscle of your finger, the muscle of your hand, some muscle. And so it takes more than one. It takes two neurons. Well, we can't call them first order and second order. We already used that. Instead, they're called upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. So if we look here, here is an upper motor neuron right here. That's our upper. And it's going to come down and it's going to synapse. And look, right here's where it synapses. And then we get the lower motor neuron, and that's going to go out to the muscle we're controlling. But remember, those same things are going to hold true. It's going to start in a very specific place, so we're going to have somatotopy. They're going to cross over. Look, crossing over happened right there. That's decussation. And again, it takes more than one neuron. So we have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. There are two of these tracts. Remember, there's an anterior and the lateral. Remember, they're not the same size. The lateral is much bigger. The anterior is much smaller. So if we look at this picture, the lateral one is the one that's going to be going to the hands and the fingers. And the anterior one, this one, which is smaller, is going to be going to the feet and the toes. Now, corticospinals also control other muscles. They control muscles of the neck, the trunk, and we already said the arms and the legs. Okay, let's look at the non-pyramidal. So again, they cannot start with the word cortico. It has to be something else. So rubrospinal. This tells me it does not start in the cortex. It starts in something called the red nucleus, because rubro means red. Look, vestibulo, that's not cortex. It's going to start in something called the vestibular apparatus. And reticulo is going to start in the reticular formation. And tecto is going to start in something called the tectum. But all of these are subconscious or even unconscious. Subconscious or even unconscious. And so they're muscle movements that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. So here's our rubro. There's one of the reticulos. There's the other reticulo. There's the vestibulo. There's the tecto. Those are non-pyramidal tracts. Well, when you look at these non-pyramidal tracts, where they're going to is muscles, but they're muscles that have to do with very big movements. Movements we really don't consider or spend a lot of time talking and thinking about. Those are things like posture and balance. We don't think about it. It just seems to happen all by itself. We stand up straight. Now, unless someone tells you you're standing up slumped, you just naturally stand the way you're standing. Your head just naturally goes up in the air like that. It doesn't slump to one side or the other. We just hold it upright. When you hear something, your head turns. When you see something, your head turns, almost unconsciously. It also has some degree of movement in the limbs. So in the upper limb and the upper leg, remember, not the hand and the foot, but the upper part. So all of these are subconscious movements, maybe even unconscious. It's not something we make conscious decisions about. It just seems to sort of happen. Well, if you look at these pathways, they're not clear-cut like those others are. For one thing, they can be more than 1 or 2 or 3 neurons. But let's just pick one. So look, up here is the cortex. That is where our conscious decisions are made. So that's where that happens. But look, way down deep in the brain is this thing called the red nucleus. It also makes decisions about muscles, but they're not conscious, they're subconscious decisions. And subconscious, again, is not something we spend a lot of time thinking about. Well, this one has an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron, just like the other one just did. But look, there's an extra neuron in the middle here. And so there's a middle motor neuron. And sometimes there can be 1, 2, or even 3 middle motor neurons. In other words, they're complex pathways and they're multisynaptic. They have several synapses. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. But here's kind of what they do. So vestibulo controls things like posture. It keeps you from falling down. They're anti-gravity muscles. Reticulo is all about balance. All about if something pushes you in one direction, you push back in the other, and so on. Rubro has to do with the muscles on the front side of the body, the flexor muscles of the top, on the back side of the body at the bottom, flexor muscles. And then tecto has to do with moving your head around, keeping your head straight, turning it from one side to the other when you hear or see something you're not familiar with, anything like that. Again, here's that example. Any questions? That's where we're going to stop for today. So if you come back this afternoon, we'll do the lab portion. But what I'm going to talk about in this afternoon in the lab is muscles. So we'll do that. All right.